let's talk about China's major country diplomacy with Chinese correct characteristics. How do you see this major country diplomacy?
I think that there is a set of important unanswered questions in terms of what China's model in international governance and international relations is meant to be and what it will in fact become. So the short answer is I don't know. I think on the one hand that it is eminently fair and proper that as China rises, as it grows in economic and other forms of power, that China's voice should be heard and that international institutions should make appropriate incremental adjustments to reflect the new reality of a world in which China's share of GDP or China's share of geostrategic power has grown. That's as it should be, and the American tradition, certainly the view of the Obama administration, was to recognize, to accept, and to facilitate that, but as part of a broader bargain, an understanding that China, having benefited from the post-war rules-based order, in exchange for being able to exercise its appropriate and growing degree of influence, continued to accept the basic premise that all countries, including China, are equally bound by the rules. So the idea is that China should have an important role in updating the rules to reflect the realities of the 21st century, but was not going to tear up the rules, was not going to claim an exemption from the rules. So the world is watching with great attentiveness to see whether the new model of China's major power presence with Chinese characteristics and the model that has been mentioned by President Xi and by others, whether this represents a departure from the 70-plus year tradition of the rules-based order, or whether it marks a next generation of that. I think that in the case of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, early on there was great confusion, uncertainty, and skepticism because China didn't do much in the beginning to explain what it was trying to create. Many people around the world felt strongly that if China was going to create a new regional or global institution, it shouldn't start from scratch. It should start from the high watermark of what other regional institutions had built up by way of safeguards and standards and best practices over the years. Over time and over kind of a messy process, I think a tremendous amount of progress was made by China with the coaching and goading of its many friends around the world. And so it seems to have headed, and if not landed, in a much, much better place. But there are still big unanswered questions about other aspects of China's global engagement. And I hope that Chinese authorities and Chinese leaders will be responsive to the advice and the concerns and the hopes of China's partners, China's friends, and the broader international community.
Right. Now let's move back to the U.S. Do you think Trump has a China policy?
What I see the Trump administration doing and what I see President Trump doing has some very familiar components to me. The effort to establish strong lines of direct communication at top leader level is an admirable objective which I can fully understand. I had the privilege of working with my Chinese counterparts early on to come up with the idea of an informal meeting between the U.S. and the Chinese president at Sunnylands, because I understood how important it was that these two leaders establish real contact, real dialogue early on. I think that was perhaps the model for President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago and so on. So that part of the equation looks very familiar to me. The Trump administration early on decided to continue the bilateral dialogues between the two sides on the strategic and diplomatic track, on the economic track, financial track, on the people-to-people track, and also the law enforcement related and cyber dialogues that had been underway. Now, they structured it a little bit differently. They broke it up, whereas we had integrated it. But it appeared in year one that they recognized that because we have two immensely complicated systems and so many interlocking interests, it's very important to complement the leader-level dialogue with these institutional structured dialogues. It's not clear to me, and it's a little hard to understand why those dialogues seem to have halted. There hasn't been a second round and so on. Now, I do know that many of my American colleagues in government have reported a sense of frustration that they're talking and talking and talking, but the problems aren't getting solved. And look, I can understand that. I relate to that. My Chinese former colleagues and friends have their own frustrations. They say sometimes the U.S. administration says this, sometimes it says that. We don't know really who's in charge of what, who should we be talking to. There's no consistency, etc. Okay, but fundamentally, we need more than just a phone call between the two presidents or an occasional meeting. We need an ongoing and, I think, structured engagement in order to work through, thrash out our differences, to understand where the other side is coming from, how far it's willing to go on an issue, and see what problem can we solve, what problem are we going to have to manage, how are we going to deal with that. And I believe that China's strategy requires all of the components that I've mentioned to maintain not only stability but also maintain progress.
Right. And what's your take on President Trump's recent tariff plan or rhetoric?
Well, there's a big difference between the plan and the rhetoric. And I hope that it stays that way. Because thus far, the tariffs that the president has announced, although they haven't been imposed yet, are focused very specifically on steel and on aluminum. Now, it just so happens that, although I'm not an expert, that those sectors may not have much direct impact on China. I don't think China is in the top 5, top 10 even of the list of steel exports to exporters to the United States. But President Trump has for some time also talked about a much broader set of tariffs, punitive tariffs, based on the assessment that China has, over time, stolen American intellectual property, has forced the transfer of technology in contravention of international rules, etc., and has made clear that he has the authority to impose potentially tens of billions of dollars or more in tariffs. And some of this seems connected, much of it seems connected to his sharp focus on the trade in goods deficit that the United States has with China. There is a lot of evidence that tariffs are not going to provide the kind of solutions and the fixes that President Trump and the American people may be looking for. At the same time, I can certainly attest to the sense of frustration that's felt not just by government officials, but by business people and by members of Congress at the lack of access to China's market for American firms, for international firms. And frustration and deep concern about the treatment, sometimes prejudicial treatment, of U.S. businesses, and not only businesses, but also of universities and NGOs and reporters and so on, who go to China from the United States. And there are many, many people asking a very simple question, which is, why should China enjoy all the benefits of dealing in a largely unregulated and open American market and society when it won't allow reciprocal, similar access to American businesses and American entities? And look, that's an understandable and a fair question. The matter is, however, really one of strategy and tactics. What is going to help to narrow this gap? What's going to help to solve these problems? And I recognize that there's a role for, shall we say, leverage, but fundamentally the solutions will have to come from mutual understanding between the United States and China. And they will have to be, in my view, to be durable and fair, they will have to reflect both our own interests, U.S. and China's interests, but also international rules. Because over time, no country can expect to be able to get treatment from other countries that it won't itself provide to its partners.